The sun had just started its slow climb over the horizon when a soft mist rolled across the abandoned stretch of Highway 7. The only sound breaking the silence was the distant call of crows and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the breeze. Along the crumbling shoulder of the road, a lone German shepherd limped slowly through the dew-covered grass, his ribs showing through a matted coat, his once proud stance lowered by exhaustion and time. His name, though no one had spoken it in weeks, was Maximum. He had been left there 2 months ago, abandoned by the only family he'd ever known. At first, Max waited faithfully by the spot where their old red truck had driven away. He didn't understand why they left. He had always been a good dog. He'd protected the children when they cried at night, barked only when necessary, and even learned to fetch the morning paper, though no one seemed to notice. But that morning, they had driven away without looking back, and no matter how many days passed, they never returned. The road was quiet now, far from any town, and most drivers who passed didn't notice the limp shape moving in the grass. A few slowed down, some even pointed, but none stopped. Max grew thinner each day, surviving off puddles and discarded fast food scraps tossed from speeding cars. The nights were the worst, cold, long, and filled with the lonely howls of other strays echoing in the distance. Max had begun to lose hope. Each morning felt heavier, each step slower, and sometimes he thought about just lying down and letting the silence take him. But everything changed one grey morning when Max spotted a figure walking along the road. Not in a car, just walking. That alone was unusual. The man was tall, wearing an old brown coat, and he carried a heavy backpack slung across one shoulder. Most strange of all was the silence that surrounded him. Not even the gravel crunched under his boots. He moved with a kind of stillness that made Max raise his head, watching cautiously from behind a cluster of overgrown weeds. The stranger saw Max almost immediately. He didn't shout or wave or even reach into his bag for food like others had done in the past to lure him. Instead, he simply stood there, a few yards away, and looked at Max with quiet eyes that didn't judge or pity, just understood. For reasons Max couldn't explain, he didn't run. He was weak, yes, but there was something about this man, something calm and almost familiar. The stranger knelt slowly, resting one hand on his knee, and waited. Minutes passed. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at the man's coat, but he didn't move. Max took one cautious step forward, then another, his body tense but his heart curious. When he was only a few feet away, the man gently placed a small piece of bread on the ground and slid it forward with 2 fingers. Max hesitated, his nose twitching at the smell. Hunger overpowered fear, and he slowly reached out to take it. It was dry and stale, but to Max, it tasted like home. The man didn't try to touch him, didn't say a word. Instead, he stood, nodded once, and began to walk away. Max stared after him, confused. No one had ever given him something without expecting something in return. And no one had walked away without trying to catch or leash him. For a moment, Max stayed where he was, ears perked, tail low. Then, as if something inside him finally stirred awake, he began to follow. He didn't know why. He didn't even know where the man was going. But there was a sense of purpose in the stranger's stride, a silent strength that made Max feel, just for a moment, safe. So he kept his distance but stayed behind, matching the man's pace as best he could on sore paws. The road stretched on, empty and endless, but with each step, Max's heart grew a little less heavy. He didn't know that this was only the beginning, that the silent stranger would lead him to a place he never imagined, a life far different from the one he had lost. As the sun climbed higher and the mist began to lift, 2 figures, 1 man and 1 dog, walked down the forgotten road together. They didn't speak, and they didn't need to. A quiet bond had been formed, one not made of words but of recognition. The silent stranger hadn't saved Max with food or pity, but with presence. And Max, sensing something deeper than kindness, followed the man into a future that neither of them could have predicted. The road narrowed as it wound through the thickening woods, the trees arching over like guardians watching the silent pair below. Max followed the stranger for hours, always a few steps behind, never close enough to touch but never letting him out of sight. His legs trembled with every step, but something inside him, a flicker of hope, maybe, pushed him forward. He didn't know where they were going, but the rhythm of the man's footsteps gave him comfort. The silence that once made Max feel abandoned now felt different, peaceful, even protective. Just as the sun dipped below the tree line, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples, the stranger stopped. Max perked up, sniffing the air. The scent of pine was strong, but beneath it was something warm and earthy, wood smoke. The man turned off the road onto a narrow, hidden trail, almost completely swallowed by underbrush. Max hesitated for a moment, his instincts cautious. But the man looked back at him for the first time that day, giving a single nod, as if saying, "It's all right." That small gesture was all Max needed. They walked deeper into the forest until the trail opened into a clearing. Nestled at the center, surrounded by towering pines, stood a small log cabin. Its roof was patched with moss, and smoke curled from a crooked chimney. A wooden porch creaked under the weight of time, and wind chimes made from old spoons and keys clinked softly in the breeze. The stranger climbed the steps, set down his backpack, and opened the cabin door without a word. He held it open, looking back at Max, who stood at the edge of the clearing, unsure. It had been so long since Max had been invited anywhere. Since someone had looked at him like he belonged. He walked slowly up the steps, his paws clicking gently against the wood. The stranger stepped aside, letting Max enter first. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by the flicker of a fireplace. The walls were lined with bookshelves and handmade tools. A kettle hung above the flames, and the scent of herbs and pine filled the air. It was small, rustic, but clean, lived in, not lonely. Max stood in the middle of the room, overwhelmed. The warmth of the fire hit his fur, and his whole body shuddered from the contrast. He looked at the stranger, unsure of what to do next. The man set his bag down by the wall, took off his coat, and without speaking, went to a wooden cabinet. From it, he pulled out a blanket, a can of food, and a small bowl. He filled the bowl with water from a jug, then gently opened the can and poured its contents, chunks of meat and gravy, into a ceramic dish. Max's stomach growled so loudly it echoed off the cabin walls, but he didn't move toward the food until the man sat quietly in a chair by the fire, giving Max space. Max crept forward and began to eat, trembling. He had to remind himself it was real. He didn't have to fight other strays or bark to be heard. There was no threat, no hurry. Only warmth, food, and silence. When the bowl was clean, Max slowly padded over to the blanket the man had laid out near the fire and, for the first time in weeks, curled up without fear. His eyes grew heavy almost immediately, the warmth lulling him into a deep sleep. The man remained by the fire, a book open in his lap, but he didn't read. He just sat there, occasionally glancing at the dog who now snored softly at his feet. That night, something unspoken passed between them. No words. No commands. Just presence. A quiet understanding. When morning came, Max awoke to birdsong and the smell of something cooking. The man stood by the stove, scrambling eggs in a cast iron pan. He slid a portion into a separate bowl and placed it near Maximum. The routine was beginning, gentle, predictable. No shouting, no chains. Just a quiet rhythm. As the days passed, Max began to heal. His fur grew softer, his eyes brighter. He still limped, but the pain began to fade. The stranger never tried to pet him or force affection. Instead, he let Max come to him in his own time. One evening, a sudden crack of thunder echoed through the valley, and Max, startled, jumped to his feet. He began to pace, ears pinned back, haunted by old memories. The man didn't speak, but he slowly sat on the floor near Max's blanket, his presence steady and calm. Max looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time, he stepped closer and rested his head gently on the man's knee. The man didn't move, didn't react, but the smallest smile crept across his face. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of trust. Of rebuilding. Of something sacred. Max didn't know the man's name. Didn't know where he came from or why he walked alone. But he knew this, he was no longer alone himself. And neither, it seemed, was the stranger. Weeks passed like falling leaves, quiet, steady, and full of change. Max's body grew stronger, but more importantly, so did his spirit. He no longer flinched at the wind or hid at loud noises. He began exploring the woods around the cabin, sniffing at squirrel tracks and chasing birds like a pup again. Each night, he returned to the cabin without needing to be called. It was home now. The stranger remained the same, silent, calm, a presence more than a person. He chopped firewood with quiet precision, cooked simple meals, read by candlelight, and always saved a portion for Maximum. They had fallen into a rhythm that felt eternal. But Max could sense there was something buried deep in the man's heart, a weight he carried beneath his calm exterior. One morning, as autumn painted the forest in shades of gold and fire, Max followed the man beyond their usual trails. The stranger walked slower than usual, his boots dragging a little. He carried a small bundle under one arm, wrapped in cloth. Max stayed close, sensing something different in the air. They hiked for nearly an hour before coming to a small clearing marked by a crooked wooden cross. It stood alone, the ground around it covered in wildflowers and pine needles. The stranger knelt by the grave and unwrapped the cloth bundle. It was a hand-carved wooden box. He opened it gently, revealing an old photograph, a small silver collar tag, and a child's drawing. A stick figure man holding hands with a large dog. Max sat beside him, feeling the sorrow in the air, thick and unspoken. The man rested the items on the grave, his hands shaking slightly. Then, for the first time, Max heard him speak. His voice was raspy, broken by years of silence. His name was Bear, he whispered. Best friend I ever had. The words were few, but they struck like thunder. Max looked up at him, understanding now. The man had lost a dog, a companion, a piece of his soul. And in that grief, he had withdrawn from the world, choosing silence over pain. Max stepped forward and gently nudged the man's hand with his nose. The man let out a shaky breath and looked at Max with eyes filled with memory and something new, healing. I didn't think I could do it again, the man said. Didn't think I could open my heart, until you. They stayed there for hours, the wind whispering through the pines. When they finally returned to the cabin, something had shifted. The stranger. His name, Max would soon learn, was Daniel, began to speak more. Just a few words each day. He would tell Max stories, about Bear, about the war, about the family he had before the silence took hold. He had been a veteran, once a respected search and rescue dog handler. Bear had been more than a partner, he had saved Daniel's life during a mission overseas. But when Bear passed, Daniel lost more than a friend. He lost his reason to speak, to connect, to exist. Until Max. That winter, the snow came early. The cabin became their sanctuary, a place of warmth and routine. Daniel built Max a bed near the fire, though Max usually snuck onto the old armchair Daniel never used. He stopped flinching when Daniel touched his fur. He began to wag his tail when he heard his name. They were no longer just man and dog. They were family. Word of their quiet bond began to spread in the small town miles away. A local vet, curious after hearing rumors of the hermit with the shepherd, made the hike one day to check on them. Daniel allowed him in, hesitantly. Max sat beside Daniel the whole time, protective but calm. The vet confirmed what they both already knew: Max had healed, inside and out. As the vet left, he turned back and said, "Whatever you two found out here, the world could use more of it." Eventually, Daniel began venturing into town again, just for supplies. Max always went with him. People were surprised by how well-trained and calm the shepherd was, but even more surprised when Daniel spoke, kindly, if softly. He never stayed long, but he always left with Max trotting proudly at his side. And slowly, the man who had once disappeared into silence began to return to the world. One spring afternoon, a group of local school kids came to visit the cabin on a nature hike. Max, now filled with energy and confidence, greeted each child gently, allowing tiny hands to pet him and even letting one boy hug his neck. Daniel smiled quietly, watching. One of the teachers asked him how Max had learned to trust again. Daniel paused, looked down at Max, and said, "Because he gave me a reason to trust again, too." That night, as the stars filled the sky, Max lay on the porch, his head resting on Daniel's foot. The forest was quiet, the fire crackled inside, and the air carried no fear, no sadness, only peace. In the silence between them, there was no need for words. The stranger had changed Max's life. But perhaps, without even knowing it, Max had saved his as well. And together, in the quiet world they had built from broken pieces, they were whole again.